is great. As we established about 5 minutes ago, when we get to the questions section, the system on Zoom to use is the Q&A bit that you can access at the bottom of the screen when you move your cursor. The chat's disabled, but the Q&A works, so we'll get to a point in probably 15-20 minutes time where we can run that, and then obviously answering your questions really is the most important part of this exercise. So thank you very much for joining. I'm very aware that this is relatively unique in terms of the meetings that we have, in that some of you will be very familiar with the LEP rather, and you know, I could list all the names from those I can see before me, but obviously some of you will be fairly unfamiliar. So I just wanted to start off with a few slides of general context, really about the LEP and what we do, just for a couple of minutes before I hand over to Rhiannon, who will talk about the Getting Building Fund a bit more specifically. So local enterprise partnerships are the primary conduit for economic growth funding from government into local areas, in terms of certainly that funding that businesses have influence over. The South East LEP is that area you see before you there, so it's Essex, South Essex, Kent and Medway and East Sussex. That makes us the biggest LEP in the country by many measures. Indeed, population, got 4.2 million people live in the area. There are 8 ports, 9 universities. You know, in normal life, over £90 billion worth of GVA per annum, and importantly as well, about 170,000 VAT registered businesses. We've had funding at our disposal over the course of the last 5 years or so called the Local Growth Fund, as well as something called the Growing Places Fund. There's a mixture there of a good £600 million that's been invested in the area. Most of that the vast majority of that is now spent. All of it is allocated to projects. And it's kept us going as an entity for those last few years, as I say, in terms of making sure that we can target good projects across the patch. That'll get us on in a few minutes to what we're talking about now, which is somewhat of an extension to the existing growth deal. You can move to the next slide, please, Rhi. Was the one before, the one after, and then yeah, that one. So we, as well as the capital program, there are other things that we do. So we're quite engaged in the skills agenda. So we have something called a skills advisory panel and a digital skills partnership, which is really about getting industry leaders together to advise on ways forward for improving skills levels and engaging people across the geography with opportunity. We also have something called the Growth Hub, which is really a one-stop shop for business support, and that operates in 3 different ways across our LEP area. That's commissioned. The delivery of it is very, very different, but actually the overall aim is to engage and support SMEs as they look to grow and create more opportunities in the area. In addition to that, there are a range of other strategic activities that I could sit here for a few hours and talk to you about. I'll avoid doing that, but I suppose a key part of our job is really that dialogue we have with government around really advising them on what we think is going to be important for bettering the economy of our area. The investment to date, so not including obviously the topic of today's discussion, is relatively well spread across the area, as you can see from this map here. So there are a good 110 local growth fund projects. That's the £600 million fund that I mentioned before. There are 33 capital skills projects. So again, of that 600 million, we ran a competition across our further education colleges to really make best use of that capital funding, and that's gone into supporting college builds as well as capital equipment. We've had something called Growing Places Fund, which continues to perpetuate. That is a loan finance fund, which is again supported a range of projects in the area, and it's particularly flexible and a really good tool to have. And what we've also been able to do is unlike other LEPs actually, is use some of the funding available to us to plough into the area to support revenue-based projects. So that might be sort of web-based portals to support a particular sector and things like that, which we've chosen to do as a LEP, which kind of goes away a little bit from kind of what I suppose the standard is, but it's been really really successful, and I think it just adds to a really healthy mix of projects that we've been able to support over the past few years. So the Getting Building Fund is, I guess, the topic of today's discussion. This is slightly different to what we've dealt with before. So there was the announcement on Getting Building Fund it all feels very recent. It's all happened over the course of the last few weeks. There was £900 million available nationally. We secured almost a tenth of that, which was a really great result for us, a great result for the area. I suppose the key thing here is the absolute focus on spend. So Getting Building Fund is there because of the impact of COVID on the economy. And what government are very keen to do is to make sure that money that's been allocated to this fund is spent and turned around as quickly as possible. So projects are happening on the ground within an 18-month time period. So there's a real focus on projects being shovel ready. Obviously, projects should all be capital projects and should be more or less ready to go. So the conversations that we've had across the LEP over the course of the last couple of weeks have really been to establish, what projects have we got, how quickly can they happen, and then now we go down that process of really making sure that everything else is in place, that we can demonstrate value for money and we can demonstrate deliverability in the way the government would always expect us to do. We are subject to the national assurance framework. We have our own local assurance framework as well, which really is about upholding the most stringent standards of governance around value for money, around deliverability, and all the other elements of good projects that you would expect us to cover. I mean, under no doubt whatsoever, this gives us a big challenge in terms of Getting Building Fund. We need to adhere to all those standards, yet put more projects through our apparatus, so our accountability board, over the next few months than I think we ever have done before. So it's a big challenge for us. It's a big challenge for local partners, but I think it's one that we'll rise to, because we're in quite a privileged position to have got all this extra funding from government, and we want to absolutely make best use of it. But again, we need to be very mindful of the possibility of clawback on this funding. So it's not been talked about quite as explicitly as it's been talked about recently in terms of this fund. So Her Majesty's Treasury have been very clear that if this money isn't spent in those 18 months, they might be looking to take it back. So we need to make sure that the assurances are there that projects are going to happen. In terms of those projects, one final thing I'll say on that is that 34 projects have been identified through our processes. They were submitted to government the week before last. We expect to hear from government or from the particular minister, despite the fact it's summer recess. We do expect to hear from them within the next week or so. And when we're at that stage, we really can push forward with, with absolutely no breaks whatsoever to make sure that we get this through the system, get it delivered. I think that might be my last slide. So at that point, I really should hand over to Rhiannon to take you through some of the detail. Thank you, and over to Rhiannon.
Thanks, Adam. So yeah, I guess the purpose of today's workshop meeting is really to outline the processes, both from a SELEP point of view, but also the expectations from central government itself. So fairly sort of high level of information, but with more detailed information around specific business cases to follow through the individual slots. So you might have seen the email went out last week that suggested dates at the end of this week and on 13th and 14th of August as well, where you can book individual slots with the ITE to have more kind of detailed conversations about your own specific business cases. So really today, we're looking at what are the overall processes that we're following, what are the value for money requirements and deliverability requirements coming from central governments, introducing the role of the independent technical evaluator, so Stephen's role, and he'll be talking about how STEER carry out the assessment on behalf of SELEP, looking at the business cases. And then briefly, I'll introduce the process once we actually secure the funding. So once you've got that accountability board approval of the funding, what are the immediate next steps that need to happen so you can start drawing down on that funding. We will then open it up for Q&A. Do feel free to ask questions while we're talking through the slides, but we'll answer those questions at the end of the discussion. So the requirements from central government, as Adam set out, it is very much, the pace of delivery is really integral here, as well as the focus on job creation and the green recovery. So through the independent assessment, you can expect we'll be asking questions around job creation, how are you going to create those jobs, how quickly can you do that, and can you provide that evidence that they can still be created given kind of COVID and the current financial position we're in. Shovel ready. Shovel ready seems to be a term that's been thrown about for several years now, but I think they really genuinely do mean shovel ready this time around. It is a case of once that funding is awarded, the expectation is that you can start immediately in delivering that project and taking it forward. Particularly, the funding, it is very time critical. So actually, we're looking at projects that can spend during this financial year as well as into next financial year, but without risk of callback if any funding goes beyond that timescale. Just to clarify as well, financial year, so we're talking 1st of April to 31st of March. I know some private they're things slightly differently, but they're the kind of dates we're talking about here. So full spend of the Getting Building Fund by 31st of March 2022. Government's been very clear on that deadline and that risk of clawback. Government's also been clear on the requirements around value for money. So despite the fact we're working to really short timescales, there is a requirement from central government that we follow both the National Assurance Framework and our own assurance framework. So that does mean that the similar requirements apply to anyone who's been involved in the local growth funds. There'll be similar requirements for this fund going forward in terms of the value for money and business case development processes. For us as Secretariat to be able to recommend to the Accountability Board the approval of the funding, what we really need is that confidence around that 31st of March 2022 date. So we're looking for programmes for you to demonstrate, can you definitely deliver within the timescales, and the spend profile about how you're going to achieve that as well. Match funding is an issue that kind of crops up quite a lot and causes delays to previous projects. So really here we're looking for that confirmation that you've got all the other funding in place, and it's simply a case of waiting for the Getting Building Fund to be confirmed before you can proceed with the project. Similar with planning consents and other sort of legal consents that you might need, Network Rail, Housing England, wherever those consents are required for, we're really expecting those to be in place by the time of the funding decision being taken by the Accountability Board, so you can proceed immediately after. No high risks to delivery. I think there's sometimes a tendency to people to say there's no risks, it's all fine. We know there will be project risks, that's true of any project. So what we're really looking for here is a detailed risk assessment that sets out what are the project risks, evidence that you've considered those risks and you've identified ways of mitigating those risks. I think that's the way we're seeking assurance that actually the project has been fully considered, you're aware of what the risks are, and there's appropriate strategies in place so you can spend by 31st March 2022 deadline. And finally, the ITE process and making sure the value for money assurances can be provided by STEER. So we need each project pass through the gate process that Steve will talk you through shortly. So the independent technical evaluation process. So we are required as SELEP to independently assess all the business cases that come forward for funding, both in terms of the value for money, but also the other cases are equally important. So how are you going to go about delivering the project? Are the finances all in place? What your procurement strategies are? And how are you going to monitor the project and evaluate it going forward as well? So this role around independently assessing business cases, that's conducted by STEER, consultants appointed on behalf of SELEP. What STEER really for, and I'll let Stephen talk about this process in more detail, is really checking for compliance with government guidance. So before LEPs and the kind of devolution agenda, everything would have gone to central government for their approval through Department of Transport and other departments, government departments. And their process were really robust in terms of compliance with their own guidance, WebTag for transport projects, MHCRG guidance for more economic development projects. So what we're looking for is similar assurances around the way that the economic appraisal is carried out and overall deliverability of projects. The STEER process, it works in two-stage approach. So gate one, followed by the opportunity for feedback and for updates to be made to the business case, and then followed by a kind of gate two review, which will be the final stage of the assessment. I'll hand over to Steve, I think, to talk a bit more about the process.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon, and good afternoon. Can people hear me? Rhiannon nodded. Yeah, thank you. Good. I'm the project director from STEER. We're a transport and economic development consultancy, and we've been working with the LEP now for about 5 years. And our main role is to provide quality assurance around the value for money statement of any business case. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to outline the process we follow in a bit more detail from Rhiannon, and then go through what we're looking for in a business case and what constitutes high value for money, as well as some of the exemptions. Then I'll move on to timescales. So many of you have already booked some slots on Thursday or Friday this week. That's particularly relevant if you're aiming to get approval at October's Accountability Board for funding allocation. And as part of that discussion, normally in about half an hour, we'll outline the timescales, the processes, and with a particular focus on the approach to economic appraisal, perhaps one of the more challenging parts of business case development. Then scheme promoters develop the first version of their outline business case. We will then review that, and then we'll look to have a discussion, probably about an hour's discussion, what we call an intergate meeting, to go through our feedback. It's meant as a constructive session. And then I think we have another couple of weeks to revise the business case before we conduct our final review and report and make recommendations to the accountability board. So what is a business case? First of all, we have to say that everything should flow from government's Green Book. If you're not familiar with the Green Book, it's government's guidance on appraisal and evaluation of schemes in receipt of public sector funding. And there are some links, and when we circulate these slides later, there'll be links to all of these things. But it's across 5 cases, or dimensions as they're now called. The first is the strategic case. So is there a rationale for intervention, a case for making change? And how does your scheme align with both government's objectives as well as the LEP and local policy objectives? And Rhiannon's already mentioned the 2 main national objectives are around jobs, but also green growth, so that any investment results in sustainable outcomes. Then the economic case is that the preferred option, the scheme, represents high value for money, and that's its economic value. And then the next is the commercial case, that the procurement route and the contracting route will result in the value for money stated, and there is prudent risk allocation or transfer. And so here's a comment in from Peter Sharp. Yeah, we'll come on to that shortly, around minimum benefit cost ratios. For the financial case, the preferred option is fundable, both in terms of capital and revenue terms. And then finally, the management case, ensuring that the scheme is deliverable and that risk will be managed effectively, and that a monitoring and evaluations and plan, and you identify how you will bring forward the benefits stated within the economic case. So onto the strategic case. We're looking for a case that is evidenced, that is aligned to policy, and demonstrates there is a clear problem or market failure that results in a need for intervention. And that can either be based on current need and or future need. Obviously, because this is the Getting Building Fund and it's directly response to COVID-19 and its economic and wider impacts, we need to understand if the case for intervention still applies. How does COVID-19 affect the case for investment? Does it make it stronger, weaker? Has it arisen only because of COVID-19? We need to know. And I already mentioned about alignment with objectives, SMART. I think you'll be familiar with SMART. So that's specific, measurable. I'm going to forget what these are now. But you'll all be familiar with SMART objectives. Yeah, reasonable and time-bound. There we go. And I've identified the 2 there from the government about growth and jobs and a green recovery. And then there are 5 LEP local priorities: modernising town and city centres, physical infrastructure to improve the local economy, human capital, including business support, innovation, and digital connectivity. And it doesn't matter, your scheme might not align with all of those, but we're keen to see how it does align, and it needs to be more than just a statement that it does. Justify it, tell us how it aligns. Also in the strategic case, we find it good practice if you can identify a logic map. And by this, we want to understand how, from the need, if like the problem statement, the market failure you've identified, how then your scheme addresses that with its inputs, outputs, and outcomes, and then how the outcomes loop back round to the objectives of the scheme. And that helps ensure that what we're looking at is watertight. So, for example, we're not claiming benefits that don't relate to the objectives. We're not identifying outcomes that don't relate to the issues, that there is a clear flow through. We also want to see, and normally you might see this in an economic case, for those of you familiar with slightly other processes, but we've asked for this to be in a strategic case, that we see a number of alternative options having been considered. So, for example, this isn't a scheme in search of a problem. You've considered a clear need for intervention. You've then considered a number of different options for how you might address that need for intervention, and that you've sifted those different options against the objectives for the scheme. Now, this can be a qualitative process, But again, it's very important that we see alternative options being considered. And that needs to just be more than your preferred option and a do-nothing scenario. And then finally, we want to understand the interdependencies. Often schemes are interrelated to other schemes that have complex stakeholder environments. The planning permission, land acquisition might be required. And as Rhiannon already mentioned, we need to make sure a lot of this has already happened. The planning permissions and land acquisition and other consents already need to be in place. So it's very clear how they'll be identified and programmed within a very tight time frame. And yeah, as I said, understanding those relationships with other schemes. Now if we move on to the economic case, thank you, Rhiannon. We need to understand the costs that you're identifying and the breakdown of those. We need to also understand your methodology for forecasting the benefits. So we don't just see a quick presentation of benefits and then some sort of summation of those. We need to understand how you've derived those. Again, and in each of the cases, there'll be a spotlight on COVID-19. COVID-19 might have many impacts that might undermine or potentially even improve the case for investment. But for example, if we think there'll be less usage of public transport, a public transport intervention, its economic case might be undermined by COVID-19. Similarly, investment that might improve footfall in a town centre as part of a regeneration scheme. Does the case still exist if there's going to be lower footfall, for example, or evidence to show that your local areas are already bouncing back quickly? We expect to see the costs and benefits monetised so that you can compare them. And then in terms of the presentation of a benefit cost ratio, we're looking for a benefit cost ratio of greater than 2 to 1. So high value for money is defined as being greater than 2 for 1, in line with Treasury's own guidance. Hopefully that addresses your question, Peter. We also want to consider the non-monetised and non-quantified benefits. We know that there are aspects of economic appraisal that are very tricky. There are some benefits that don't necessarily lend themselves to being quantified or monetised, and also that given the value of the funding you're seeking might be disproportionate to embark upon a process of quantifying or monetising those. Then move on to the commercial, oh, not quite the commercial case. Sorry, one before, please, Rhiannon. Oh, no, the one with the table. I think it's one slide. There we go. Thank you. In terms of the different sorts of schemes, there's a very broad range of interventions coming forward. I think there are 34 schemes that have some form of programme entry for the Getting Building Fund. And this is really why we want to have the discussions with you Thursday or Friday this week or next month. There's some more slots if you're going for the November Accountability Board. We probably won't have time to answer specific questions about specific schemes. But really there are a range of recommended appraisal methodologies from central government and government departments, and the National Assurance Framework and the LEP's own local assurance framework require suitable appraisal methodologies to be used. So, for example, if you're bringing forward a skills-based scheme, the sorts of outputs might be around learner numbers, job outcomes, or the GVA impacts of upskilling, and we'd expect the SFA appraisal toolkit to be used. Similarly, if it's a scheme that is there to accelerate the delivery of housing, we want to understand the outputs in terms of dwellings and units and residential floor space, and then the most suitable guidance would be MHCLG's land value uplift appraisal guidance. But we also know, and some of you that have brought business cases through before will know that that doesn't necessarily work for all non-transport schemes, and therefore it may be feasible to use what was the HCA Homes and Communities Agency's additionality guide. And we think that's particularly pertinent where the outputs are very much job specific and not about increasing the value of land on which those jobs are located. We also know there are interventions coming forward in the digital space. And again, a bit more difficult and less clear what appraisal guidance should be used there. But again, the HCA additionality guide in line with the Green Book could be useful around GVA impacts. So for example, the jobs that might be enabled by having better digital connectivity. However, if it is around housing, it might be about the land value uplift that digital connectivity can give. And then other areas around innovation, it could be around improvements to air quality, reductions in carbon emissions, new patents, and all have methods for their quantification. Again, all available on gov.uk. If you look up appraisal, and again, some other departmental methodologies. And that's why we're really looking forward to having those discussions at the end of the week or next month, so we can discuss and make sure you're using the right method. So onto the financial case. This is making sure that the scheme is fundable and that those sources of funding are secure. So we're particularly interested, again, this also relates to the timescales and the short timescales for delivery. We want to know that the other funding sources, particularly the match funding, is in place. We know, and it's just a sort of function of the complexity of some of the schemes that have been through the LEP before, that schemes can often be held up because of a third party's funding, whether that's Highways England, Network Rail, a private sector investor waiting for developer contributions, for example, can really hold up schemes. So we want to see that it's all secured. We also want a breakdown of the capital and revenue costs. I think it's important that we can scrutinise the costs, make sure that they're proportionate to the intervention. We also want to be clear about your levels of risk and contingency that have been included in the financial case, and to make sure there hasn't been any confusion with optimism bias. Again, optimism bias is something we'd want to see in the economic case, but not the financial case. On the commercial case, this is really about making sure that there is a clear plan for contracting and procurement, that if it's a particularly innovative scheme, that the market is suitably mature to be able to respond to your procurement with the right resources and the right program. And we know that many partners locally are struggling at the moment, given the COVID-19 situation, and that we want to understand that your supply chain and your own organisation has the commercial viability to deliver. And then finally, if we move on to the management case, we'd like a realistic and achievable work programme that ensures that spend and delivery are in lockstep, and that it meets the requirements of the Getting Building Fund and the LEP in terms of timescales. We would expect to see a comprehensive risk register, with each risk having an owner, mitigation strategy, and timescale for monitoring update. For larger schemes, we'd also expect to see a quantified risk assessment where any impacts and mitigation are costed and also articulated in terms of timescale. Around COVID-19 resilience, we really want to see that your delivery partners have availability of resource, that they can get out on site for construction, for example, and that there aren't any envisaged barriers. And again, as Rhiannon said at the start, we know all schemes have risks, project risks. We are pragmatic, but we do want to see a detailed consideration of this and a particular spotlight on the resilience to COVID-19. And then finally, we'd like to see a benefits realisation plan and a monitoring and evaluation plan. Now, these can come at gate 2. And Rhiannon, feel free to come in on this, perhaps when we look at the timescales. But the benefits realisation plan is saying, well, you've identified the strategic case, the need for intervention, and how the scheme will address that, and how the scheme will be beneficial. In the economic case, you've sought to quantify and monetize those benefits. Now in the management case, tell us how you will bring those forward, when they will be achieved, who will bring them forward, what actions will be taken to bring them forward. And then the monitoring and evaluation plan will set out how you will, well, what it says on the tin, how you will monitor the impacts, well, the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes in the impacts. Now, many schemes might have a dozen or more potential benefits or impacts. But in the monitoring and evaluation plan, we're really keen on that kind of no more than half a dozen key areas of benefit that you will be able to monitor. And it is the responsibility of the scheme promoter to fund and deliver the monitoring and evaluation. So again, there's a need to be pragmatic and focus on the most important benefits or areas of impact. Just a quick slide on monitoring and evaluation and what we'd expect to see there. So again, there's logic flow from inputs to outputs to outcomes to impact. Some examples here. So inputs are the funding and resources that you'll put into delivering the scheme. The outputs is the physical infrastructure asset that is delivered as a result of the scheme. Outcomes are then the likely short and medium term benefits or impacts. So, for example, an increase in jobs resulting from the employment floor space, and then the impacts will be the increase in local GVA. And again, we've got templates for all of these things that can explain this in more detail. It's a little bit more, we expect also to understand who will be responsible for monitoring, how this will be done, the kind of survey techniques that will be used, how frequently you'll monitor these things. So some things might be suitable to monitor every 3 months, some things maybe once a year, it might take 3 or 5 years until you can really monitor something because the mechanisms are quite indirect. But again, you should be able to monitor the inputs very closely, and as you sort of go through, it might be a bit trickier or a lower level of frequency. And again, that pragmatic recommendation to focus on no more than 5 or 6 outputs or outcomes, to really focus on those key things for deliverability. So once we've conducted our assessment, one of our roles here is to assess whether the benefit cost ratio is high and therefore above 2 to 1, or low, or medium and therefore below 2 to 1. But we also look at the business case in the round, and so we consider the sort of overall certainty or risk of achieving that high benefit cost ratio. And we end up with this 2x2 grid. So if there's high benefit cost ratio and high certainty of achieving that, we put it forward for recommendation for funding from the accountability board. If the benefit cost ratio is below 2, but we have high certainty and it meets some of the exemptions, we may still put it forward as a recommendation, and it will be for the LEP board to consider its own appetite for risk and whether it meets those exemptions. On the left-hand side, things get a bit trickier. If we've got very low certainty, so therefore we think it's high benefit cost ratio, but perhaps a low certainty of achieving that, again, it goes back to the LEP's board and the conditions for exemption. But if there's low benefit cost ratio and low certainty, we can't assure high value for money. And it's not technically our role to say that we don't put it forward as a recommendation, but the LEP Secretariat may well make that recommendation in its papers that the board does not approve the scheme. In fact, the scheme does not even go forward to the board. So, and again, Rhiannon, I might need you with to come in on some of these exemptions, but there are 2 main areas of exemption. The first really is for schemes less than £2 million, where the benefit cost ratio is below 2 to 1 but above 1.5 to 1, or where the benefits are notoriously difficult to quantify and monetize and will be disproportionate to embark upon that process. And so these following criteria need to be met to satisfy this exemption. The scheme must be seeking less than £2 million of funding. There must be an overwhelming strategic case, and it must be most likely that if we were to quantify and monetize the benefits, it would result in a benefit cost ratio above 2 to 1. So we're aware that I think about 2/3 of the schemes coming forward are seeking less than £2 million of getting building fund. This isn't a get out clause to be used, but we do understand that we may need to consider this exemption. Rhiannon, anything else on this exemption?
I guess on that one, I think it's called a value for money exemption. It doesn't mean you don't have to do any value for money. It doesn't mean leaving that section blank. What it really means is if you're not hitting that 2 to 1 ratio and you're below £2 million, we do understand actually the cost of calculating all of these benefits can be, we would be disproportionate perhaps to the amount of funding that certain schemes are seeking. So in this section, even if you're saying actually we're below 2 million, we do expect some attempt to quantify the benefits, at least set out the benefits within a section of the business case.
Thanks, Rhiannon. And then on to the next exemption. And this one gets used less, but this is where the scheme does not have high value for money. In fact, doesn't have medium. It has it's just over 1 to 1, so low value for money. And here there's even more criteria that need to be satisfied. So if the scheme has a benefit cost ratio of 1 to 1 but below 2 to 1, not only is there an overwhelming strategic case, not only is it demonstrable additionalities, so clarity about how the intervention will address market failure and attempts at quantification of the benefits, but also there are no project risks identified as high risk and high probability after mitigation. And in fact, that's a criteria for all schemes, given the tight deadlines for delivery by government. But we also require value for money assurances from a government department, agency, or body. So as I said, we're really looking for a benefit cost ratio over 2 to 1, but there are some circumstances in which we understand that the scheme might still have a very strong strategic case and have a good case for funding. All of these exemptions are found in the assurance framework as well for the LEP. And I think that might be my last slide. Over to you, Rhiannon.
Thank you. For anyone who's feeling like information overload is happening, we will be sharing slides on the website, and we can send it around as a link. And we're also recording this session, so you can watch me and Stephen back at your own leisure. Yeah, I think that's useful. You know, there's quite a lot of detailed information that we're talking about here. There will be a chance to recap some of it during the individual slots as well when you speak to Steve. So, you know, making it more tailored towards your individual business case and the project you're bringing forward. In terms of the deadlines, so timescales are tight to try and get this through. You know, we want to speed up our process as much as possible, and we've introduced an extra board meeting to try and make sure we can approve the funding and it can start to flow through at the local level. So the very tight deadline is the 10th of August to make it for the 16th of October accountability board. Appreciate that's not going to be feasible for everyone. It's just, you know, if you have got a business case that's ready to go, it gives you the opportunity to come forward, you know, as soon as possible to seek that funding decision. So for anyone coming forward for the 10th of October, we would recommend you speak to Steve and his team this Thursday and Friday to book a slot to make sure, you know, everyone's comfortable with the business case that's coming forward. For those who, you know, are not quite at that point, the 11th of September is the next deadline, and that will take you through the steps, you know, set out here, which again I will share, to come forward for a 20th of November accountability board decision. So yeah, as Steve's talked about, he's talked about a Gate 1 submission, which you can see here as the initial business case submission. There'll be then an opportunity to have a call with Steer through this intergate meeting. So that will happen as a phone call conversation with Steve and his team to talk about their initial assessment of the project before the business case is resubmitted. There's a couple of things that need to come with that second submission. So that's the Section 151 officer sign-off from the lead county unitary authority that's promoting the project. We're also recognising that there's a lot of work there on monitoring and evaluation. So we're comfortable, you know, ideally that would come forward as part of the original business case submission on the 10th of August or the 11th of September. If that's, you know, just not feasible, you know, you can submit that as part of the Gate 2 review. So that second business case, once you've responded to Steer's comments, you know, you include it at that stage instead. The point is, business cases go on the website for all projects. That's quite a useful tool in some ways. You can have a look at some of the business cases for local growth funds that have already gone through the process, and they might be fairly similar to your schemes. But it does mean, you know, you need to make sure if there is information in the business case that is genuinely confidential, so personal information or, you know, information that might, you know, be considered commercially sensitive, so might impact your negotiations with contractors. You know, you need to be able to highlight that to us, either an email or sort of highlight that section within the business case in yellow highlighter, so it's really clear that that needs to be redacted before it goes onto the website. We'll email out on that point so everyone's clear. The management of the fund, once you've got that accountability board approval, so the accountability board that will meet on the 16th of October or the 20th of November, that is a public meeting. So if you want to listen in, you're kind of welcome to do that, and you can follow it through the kind of approval process. Once the board's approved it itself, the flow of the funding will take place via the lead county or unitary authority. So if you're a kind of a third party, private sector or university, the funding will flow initially to the lead county or unitary authority, and then agreements will be put in place between the county or unitary authority with the third party organisation. So that county council or unitary authority, they'll be responsible for checking sort of claims, invoicing and things in advance of the payments being made out to the third party. That will also help us to oversee the delivery of the programme. So each quarter we go out to the county unitary authorities to request updates on delivery of the project. Therefore, you know, when we ask authorities for updates, they'll be asking you for updates on the delivery of projects. And those updates, they will go to the accountability board again. So the accountability board being all the 6 unitary and county leaders that sit on that board, and their role in kind of overseeing those investments, as well as the main strategic board, so the wider board. So do be careful, you know, have honest conversations with both the county and unitary authority and ourselves as SELEP, but certain aspects of it will be put into the public domain when you're formally submitting reports to us. In terms of the project delivery itself, we are working to very tight timescales. But if there are major changes to the delivery of the projects, they will need accountability board again approval before those changes are actually made. So if your timescales are changing, costs, scope, benefits, any of those sorts of aspects, that will require a change through our change request process. So that's another thing to be aware of. And yeah, once you've successfully completed the scheme, we will be looking for that project evaluation. So an initial report 1 year after the completion of the scheme. And that really is about what lessons have we learned from the delivery of the project? Have we delivered it to time and budget? If not, what can we learn from that? And what can we kind of transfer to other projects that are kind of still coming through the pipeline? And then following that, a 3 and 5 year after evaluation. And that is much more focused on, have you delivered the benefits that you set out to achieve, or are you on track to deliver those benefits? And again, government will be asking for that information, and we'd like to be able to publish that and make it available to stakeholders, so we can kind of tell the story about what we've achieved from the delivery of our programme. Yeah, again, conscious that was quite a lot of information to get through. So in terms of the really key next steps, I would really highly recommend sort of half-hour slots with Steve and his team to talk about the specific business cases. We've included the web link here. These slides are, I think, already on our website, but we'll send them out after this meeting. The business case sign-off is required from the county unitary authority, as I've said. So do keep in touch with your county or unitary authority lead as well, not just with the SELEP team. Both parties sort of need to be involved through the process. And then, yeah, again, just the key dates. So the 16th of October or the 20th of November, accountability board. They're the really key dates to kind of aim for. Finally, just a list of some useful links that might be helpful. So links to our assurance framework and some examples of different projects that we've seen come through the process already. So on our website, there are some really good examples of strong business cases across a whole range of different projects. So do have a look. You can access it via, there's a project map page on our website, which is really useful anyway, just to see what's going on in your area. But do use that to kind of look at some projects that are similar. And then there's the links to the various government guidance around the appraisal. Adam, I think I'm handing back to you for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. So now's an opportunity for you to pose any questions on the Q&A section of Zoom. The most important part of this session really is you having the opportunity to ask any of those questions. So we've taken a few already. We've answered them as the meeting's been moving along. So if you've got any to ask, give it a bit of thought over the next few seconds and type them out, and we'll have them answered. But while you're doing that, I'll ask one of Steve, and a non-scripted one, so I'll put you to test you out, Steve. So I've got a project. It's made it onto the I haven't actually. I'm just making it up. It's made it onto the list. 5 million quid. It's the Adam Innovation Centre. A little bit overwhelmed by what I've heard over the last 40 minutes or so. I think I've got quite a lot of work to do. What sort of top 3 things do you think I need to think about in starting to put my business case together? Bearing in mind, I understand what you've said about the cases that I need to make, and taking all your advice as read. What really do I need to bear in mind as I'm starting on this task?
Thanks for that, Adam.
No problem.
I mean, it goes without saying, please follow the guidance. Please use the templates. The guidance isn't just from the LEP, it's from central government. So I think that goes without saying, but I think probably the number one reason for us flagging things as being, and we should mention that when we conduct our assessments, we've got some assessment templates, and we can share those as well, but it's often that things, just the guidance hasn't been followed. So get familiar with the guidance. I think it's just as much, the second one will be, it's just as much about the rationale and justification for any assumptions as it is the kind of numbers. So we can get very fixated on benefit cost ratios, and that is important. But for example, we're not seeking to kind of rank schemes by their BCR. So any number that you provide, any kind of statement you provide justification for it. So it's not just the what, but the how and the why. It's really challenging for us to assess a business case if you can't substantiate any assertions or numbers. And I think the third area would be making sure that is that really strong logic chain. Very clear set of objectives that have already been provided by government and from the LEP. that there is a clear need for intervention, that you consider a number of options and how they meet the objectives, that your preferred option also is clear how it addresses the need for intervention, problems and opportunities. It's a clear specification of the scheme's benefits, that you quantify those, monetize them if possible, say how you'll fund and deliver the scheme successfully, and then also how you'll bring forward those benefits to achieve your objectives. And again, it loops back around to the objectives. If you can clearly articulate that loop from objectives, need to intervention, options, preferred option, funding, benefits, objectives, it's a good start.
Thank you. Very helpful. So I'll go into some real questions now. So we've got a couple through already. So the first one, I'll ignore the one that says "What's in your cupboard, Rhiannon?" from Tim, and go into one from Sarah.
You can dismiss that one. I'm going to click dismiss on Tim's. There we go.
So Sarah Nerden asks, has the government indicated any lighter touch approach to business case appraisal will be acceptable given short time frames? Sorry, so has the government indicated that anything lighter touch will be acceptable given the fact that we're working such a...
Yeah, I'm not aware anything has. That being said, the fixation on job growth and green growth would suggest that an approach that is more aligned with the HCA's approach, which is around really the GVA impacts per jobs created or safeguarded, or jobs supported or safeguarded, is something they're interested in. They are interested also in construction jobs, which previously have been excluded. So I think Sarah, I think it's really about having those sessions later this week or next month to make sure that we find the appropriate method for economic appraisal and that we're pragmatic, that trying to kind of shoehorn something into a land value uplift approach, which doesn't suit all schemes, that we don't become too dogmatic about that.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Next question from Ollie Pendered. Hi, Ollie. He asks, how time consuming will the year 1, 3 and 5 feedback be?
So, yeah, I think the monitoring evaluation is important for any projects, doing that evaluation, see how things have gone. I think it becomes less time consuming if you're capturing those lessons throughout the delivery of the project. I think what we're finding is, project managers deliver a project, move on to the next project, and then the information's lost. So actually it is keeping these documents as kind of live documents that you can be updating throughout the delivery of the project, and that makes life so much easier. I think as well, in the past, we've sort of introduced the requirements around monitoring evaluation after the project's already been approved, whereas actually, it seems like a lot of work to get these monitoring evaluation plans in place at the outset. Actually, what you really need is this baseline to say how many, if you're delivering a cycling scheme, how many cyclists are you expecting? So when you're going out to do those counts, you've got an idea about what you're looking for, and what your initial baseline was, to be able to kind of capture that data. So yeah, we can also share the actual templates for the 3 years after and 5 years after. We do encourage scheme promoters to identify, how are you going to resource those going forward? Because, it is something that does take a bit of work to do and get right, but it's also really important for the delivery of that project, but also things that come further down the line in future.
Thank you, Rhiannon. We've got no further questions, so I'll just start to do a few comments to wrap the session up, and if any further questions pop up in the meantime, I'll go back to them, because I'm conscious that this is a sort of valuable time, really, albeit people have got further opportunities to ask project specific questions in upcoming sessions. I suppose that's probably the first point I'd make by way of wrap up. Obviously Steve and his team are independent, but they're there to help you through the process. So take up those opportunities to sort of meet with Steve, whether it's this week or whether it's later. The more you can have those conversations, I think the more helpful it will be as you negotiate through the process, which will be familiar to us. The process will be very familiar to us, but actually, it's that bit more difficult because the pace is all there. Don't lose sight of the objectives from government. This is about, in the past, we've really had a focus on the outputs in terms of jobs and homes. That remains important, clearly. There's much more of an emphasis on deliverability within timescales than we've seen before. And then the last thing is obviously the information that we've discussed today, as Rhiannon's already said, is all available on the website. Then So please access that, get in contact with us directly at hello@southeastlep.com if you've got any further questions. As I've been speaking, a couple of questions have come up from Connie Kerbst in Essex County Council. Hi, Connie. Connie asks, so the engagement sessions are only available this week, Thursday and Friday. Are there any further slots? So you've already talked about further slots kind of a month on, Rhiannon. What's the situation with being able to put any
Yeah, so we've got
alternative dates
slots, 13th, 14th of August. I think we're thinking, Steam Motors looking to submit their business case on the 10th of August. That's pretty tight. So what we could potentially add an additional date, perhaps next week. Steve here to see if that's feasible. If people are really struggling and want the extra time next week, you could potentially organise that.
Okay, we'll look at taking that one forward. Hope that works for you, Connie. A question from Lawrence Jenkins. Skills Funding Agency Appraisal Toolkit. Are you able to advise where this is, as this is an old agency?
Yeah, we can send some links around.
Thank you. Just any further questions, just give people another minute or so to ask anything else. But as we said before, here to help. It's in all of our interest to make sure that we can get all the projects through the system. Hopefully we will get final approval from ministers over the course of the next week to go, and that'll be really exciting. We have a real opportunity, I think, here to make a real splash with this fund. We've got an awful lot more money than any other LEP or combined authority area has received, so that's a great boon for us, and I think it's going to be a real focus for us over the coming weeks and months. So thank you for your engagement with it. Hope that today's been useful. I can't see any further questions, so I think really I should wrap it up. I'm wrapping up one of my own meetings within time, so that's a record in itself. So thank you, Rhiannon. Thank you, Steve. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Don't hesitate to get in touch by the means we've already explained, should you wish to. And good luck with the development of the project and the business cases. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks very much. Cheerio.
Everyone, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.